Okay, so far we said we want to do many things differently from our competitors so that they're unable to copy everything that we do. So let's say our competitors are able to copy 70% of the activities that we are engaged in. If they were still be able to get 70% of our benefits, that would be fairly bad news because it would mean that our competitive advantage will erode fairly quickly. Now, what would be better is, right, they copy 70% of what we do and they get less than 70% of the benefit. What would be really good news is that they copy 70% of what we do and they don't get any benefit, or they may even make a loss. Now, the good news about this good news is that this can actually happen. It can happen if the activities that create your competitive advantage, if these activities are mutually reinforcing, if they are starting to form a system. So let me give you an example about this. Southwest Airlines is a low-cost airline in the United States, which over the last 2 decades has been by far the most successful airline in the US. Have much higher profitability and have flown many more customers than many other airlines. What made Southwest so successful? Well, if I would be wearing my core competency hat, right, trying to find that one thing that they are so good at, I might point my finger at their ability to turn planes around quickly at the gate. It takes Southwest between 15 to 20 minutes for a plane to arrive at the gate, for all the passengers to get off, for the new passengers to get on, and for the plane to pull off the gate again. It's actually quite marvelous. While I wait quite often in Philadelphia now for my plane to come in and out, I look across and see at the other terminals Southwest zipping in and out of their gates like crazy. It is quite marvelous. Now, why is this important? Well, of course, right? Planes only make money when they fly, so that really drives their profitability a lot. So then, of course, we ask, so why are they able to turn around their planes so quickly? And we dig a little bit deeper, and we find, they have some interesting incentive systems in place, and they have somewhat more flexible union contracts that allows people to be more cross-trained, so they have these cross-trained teams that can do various tasks. But then as we dig deeper, what we find actually is an entire system of choices that Southwest has put together that collectively makes Southwest so successful. So let's look at Southwest Airlines' activity system. And we see there are lots of choices on them, and actually collectively these choices make Southwest so efficient and effective. So for instance, one reason they're able to turn around their planes so quickly is that they have very limited passenger services. For instance, they don't have seat assignments. What you get is, you get a boarding pass and there's a number on it. And according to that number, you line up in the terminal and then you walk on the plane and you grab any seat you see. They don't have meals, so they don't have to wait for caterers to come to restock the plane. They don't have baggage transfers or connections with other airlines. So we never have to wait for some delayed plane to come and we get finally the bags from that delayed flight onto our plane. We always have all the bags of all our passengers sitting right next to the plane and we are ready to leave. Now, having these fairly limited passenger services also requires us to have a somewhat restricted route system. So Southwest flies mainly short haul, point to point, and quite often from more secondary airports that are not big hub and spoke airports. Now, having the standardized route set allows us to standardize our aircraft. So Southwest flies only 737s. Oh, now we can start to see, right? If the same type of aircraft pulls in and out our gate all day long, we can become quite efficient in turning around these planes. Likewise, if our plane breaks down, our pilot knows how to fly the replacement plane because it's the same type of plane. Now, all of these things lead to a very low cost. These low costs get translated into low ticket prices. These low ticket prices increase the utilization. So all of this forms together a system that is highly efficient and effective. Now, to me, the interesting thing about this story is the following. We all know this. We've been teaching the Southwest case forever. Every incumbent CEO of all the incumbent big airlines knows what Southwest is doing. And still, year in and year out, Southwest is beating all of their competitors. That, to me, is the interesting part of the story. So, how have the incumbent full-service airlines reacted to Southwest? Well, of course, the first reaction was to ignore, right? It was this crazy little airline in Texas, so fine. We didn't have to do anything about that. But of course, at some point, Southwest became large enough to be sort of a thorn in the side of the large incumbent carriers. Now, incumbent firms have basically two broad options of how to respond to a new entrant who has a new positioning. Either the incumbent firm says, that's an interesting positioning, right? In this case, sort of a low frills, low cost airline. Who would have thought that positioning exists? Well, let's take my firm and move to that positioning. So let's reposition my firm. Now, that fairly rarely happens. More often what happens is that a large incumbent firm says, that's an interesting positioning. Let's do that as well. Let me try to straddle these two different positions. So a number of these incumbent firms tried to straddle. The first one was Continental. So Continental creates a subsidiary, which they call Continental Light. And they say, okay, let's create a subsidiary that sort of kind of looks like Southwest. And maybe we are not as efficient as they, but maybe good enough. So what they do is they duplicate a number of the activities that Southwest has put in place for a number of the routes. So what do? They fly point to point, but still using the hub and spoke airports. They rip out the first class seats. They don't serve meals. They lower their prices, and they try to turn around these planes more quickly. Now, in order to lower these fares, of course, we need to contain our costs. So we need to also now make choices in the mothership, and Continental, the full-service airline. So what do we have to do there? Well, we have to reduce the commissions to our travel agents. We have to rejiggle our frequent flyer program. We have to restructure our fares on all the short flights, and we have to move our advertising budget around. And lastly, there are a few things that Continental doesn't copy. So we're still a full-service airline in the mothership. We still fly out of our existing hub-and-spoke airports. We still use different types of aircraft, because that's what we have. We do allow interline baggage checking and seat assignments. So roughly speaking, what we've done is we copied sort of 70% of what Southwest was doing, and so the hope was that we are at least good enough to make their life miserable. But what happened? What happened was basically chaos. Chaos for Continental. Because we're still flying out of these fairly congested hub-and-spoke airports, but we now do this more often during the day. So operational problems, delays, cancellations just escalate. Our customers are really confused. They're saying, what do you mean I don't get a meal here? Because I just got off a Continental flight and I got a meal. Now I don't get a meal, but it still says Continental on the plane. What's going on? Our frequent flyers are upset because we just cut their frequent flyer miles. Our travel agents are upset, we just cut their commissions. And worst of all, we're not making any money. Why? Well, because Southwest figured out how many people want to fly from A to B at a certain price point. Now we just added overcapacity to these routes, and we can't fill our planes. So maybe one lesson to learn here is please never, never, never start a price war if you have the high cost. Okay, that's a really bad idea. So what happens to Continental? Well, Continental loses hundreds of millions of dollars. Continental's CEO gets fired. Really bad story if you're Continental. Really great story if you're Southwest. Right, here you are, the young upstart, and the big guy comes after you, and in trying to come after you, destroys itself. So why did this happen? Well, I would argue it happened because what Southwest was doing was not just one or two tweaks away from what Continental was doing. It was not just one or two new best practices. Because if that had been the only thing that Southwest had done, Continental just could have copied those one or two things and squashed Southwest. But what Southwest did is they put together a whole system of different activities, and unless you copied a lot, if not the entire system, you wouldn't get much of the benefit. Now, the other interesting thing about this particular story is that it just repeats itself again and again and again. So in the US, basically every large incumbent carrier tried this. You had Delta with a subsidiary called Song. You had United with a subsidiary called TED. But you can also go to Europe. You had KLM. They tried with Buzz. You had British Airways. They tried with Go. And each and one a failure. So it turns out that in this industry, and actually in many industries, it is very, very difficult to try to straddle two different positions with different activity systems. It is a very difficult undertaking to run different activity systems within the same organization. And that was one of the reasons that made Southwest's advantage so sustainable, because other firms would have to copy an entire system, and that was a very difficult thing to do.